Hello. So, I have been wanting to make a video for a really long time about books with absolutely beautiful writing. And when I immediately think of the type of books that I want to include in that, my mind goes straight to writers like Clarissa Spector, James Baldwin, Jeanette Winterson. And as much as I love those writers, and I do plan to make videos in the future completely centered on their works, I also feel like they've been so discussed on the internet that I don't know if I would actually bring anything new or interesting to the conversation. I will try, but that's not what I want to do today. Today, I want to focus on books that I think are so beautifully written and put together, but that I've found not many people on the internet have talked about. I'm sure they've popped up here and then, but just en masse, I feel like these books are underrepresented, and hopefully it can give you some new recommendations that maybe you haven't heard before yet. Preface: these are all novels. I think that if I were to include nonfiction and poetry and even short story collections, the list would just go on and on. I have 10 here. I had 30 originally, but I do not want this video to be hours and hours long because I will talk for that long forever and ever. And I hope that's not annoying. I do like to yap a little bit. So I hope that this is something that's enjoyable, and I'll try and be as succinct as I possibly can. So let's start with the very first book, The Book of Monelle by Marcel Scwob. I feel like the best way that I can describe how this book is written is that it's written for ghosts. I think it's one of the most strange books that I've ever read, but in the most beautiful way. So this book is written by Marcel Scwob, who was writing in the late 1800s in France. He was a contemporary of writers like Wismar and his book Against Nature, and I was going to include it in this video, but it did get cut off. Plus, I think I have a better topic for that book. Marcel Scwob was a part of the Symbolist movement, which was an artistic and literary movement that rejected realism, it rejected naturalism, and it focused more on mystery, suggestion, and the inner spiritual life. And Schwab's writing reflects this tradition extremely well. I mean, he's one of the most central figures in the movement. And I feel like his writing or his sentences are like veils in the way that they conceal and reveal simultaneously. Marcel Scwob was fascinated by language and myth and people who lived marginal lives, so beggars, seamstresses, saints, pirates. These are the sorts of characters that appear in his books. So, the Book of Monelle, particularly though, was written in 1894, and it was written in response to Marcel Scwob losing a young woman that he loved named Louise. She died of tuberculosis and she lived in poverty. And in many ways, this book is his act of mourning her. He transforms his grief into this very book, and it is painfully beautiful. Monelle is an angel, she's a muse, she's a ghost, and she speaks in these riddles and these commands and prophecies to the reader. So the book is divided into 3 parts, and the first part is very much Monelle speaking in this sort of prophetic language. And then the second part of the book is called The Sisters of Monelle, which tell these short allegorical stories about different girls, but they're really each representing a fragment of Monelle's spirit. and then the third part is the death of Monelle. What I think makes this book so beautiful is what the prose does. Marcel Scwob is essentially writing this book and using art as an act of resurrection. He's resurrecting Louise through writing this book, and it's a wonderful thing to witness. And it, of course, touches on heartbreaking things about the fleetingness of love and how the things that we cherish most are often things that we can't hold on to, and about innocence and the eventual inevitable loss of such innocence. And you can just feel his grief in every single line. And it's reminiscent of writers like Borges and Italo Calvino, and that's because he was a big influence on writers like Borges and Calvino, and you can feel that influence when you subsequently read those writers. You can feel Scwob in their works. They too write in symbols. So, in short, you can read this book in one sitting, but at least for me, it's lingered on like a, a half remembered dream, is the best way that I can describe how this book is stuck to me. Next up, I have Malina by Ingeborg Bachmann. This book is beautiful and terrifying and completely unlike anything that I've read. It's a 20th century novel that takes the form of a love story, but it is anything but a love story. It is the furthest thing from a love story that I think you can ever get. And it's really our narrator's descent into madness and memory. So, Ingeborg Bachmann was an Austrian poet. She was raised during the Nazi years, and she was deeply shaped by sort of the moral ruins of post war Europe. She was part of the Group 47 circle in Germany, which were a generation trying to rebuild literature after fascism. And she was also a part of the Viennese Modernists. That's a group that Kafka was also a part of. But Bachmann is first and foremost a poet. And I think poets oftentimes make the best novelists, and it's because of their rhythm and the way in which they are able to speak the unspeakable. I think because ultimately I think that's what poetry is. It's this search and this quest to say the unspeakable or to express the unexpressible. And that is what this book really does feel like. It's also her only completed novel. She really was a poet, and there are moments in this that do read like poetry. So, on the surface, Malina tells the story of a woman who's unnamed. She lives in Vienna and she's caught between two men, Ivan, who's quite passionate and chaotic, and Malina, who's calm and intellectual. But these two men are not really men, at least in the novel. They don't function as men, they function as these two forces that our protagonist is caught between and trying to navigate herself between. Um, as the book unfolds, the narrator moves between these two forces, and her inner life begins to splinter under the weight of what it means to be a woman simply trying to exist and speak between these two forces. And so the book kind of functions as a psychological allegory. The book is divided into three sections. The first is this frantic, lyrical fragments. The second is more of this descent into dream and trauma, where the narrator relives the violence of her own past. And the last section is where everything dissolves. The writing is fevered. Every word just feels like it's shaking and trembling. And there are whole pages where the syntax breaks apart and into poetry, and where the narrator's voice fractures into multiple different selves. ultimately, our narrator can't seem to escape these two forces. Even her language and her grammar are written in the binaries of these two forces. And so every time she attempts to speak, her thought is absorbed into Malina's calm logic. There is a moment near the end, and I don't know how much I want to talk about the end because obviously I don't want to spoil it, but our narrator says, I lived in Ivan and I die in Malina, and that has stayed with me for a very, very long time. And the conclusion to this book is one of the most haunting that I've come across. And it's both despairing but also liberating, or it can be read potentially as liberating, but ultimately quite despairing. I would highly recommend reading Malina. It just feels like being trapped inside of a female conscience, and that's just unraveling under this unbearable pressure. And the writing is just so wonderful and poetic and beautiful. And I think if you like writers like Clarissa Spector or Marguerite Duras, who sort of turn language, or instead of writing quite methodically and structured, they sort of are breaking apart language and exploring language through their books, then I think you'll find Malina as unforgettable as I have found it. The next book is The Third Body by Hélène Cixous, I think is how you pronounce it. It's a French name. This has close ties to Malina by Ingeborg Bachmann in the sense that it is also a sort of book that is focusing on language. And the best way that I can maybe describe the writing in this book is like it feels like the writing has turned to liquid. It flows between memory and love and myth throughout the novel. And the book is written by Hélène Cixous, who's a French Algerian writer, philosopher, theorist, who I think is one of the most important voices to come out of France during the 20th century. She became known for her theory, écriture féminine, or feminine writing. And that's not writing written by women, but it's writing that seeks to write through the body. For her, the body and writing are inseparable. To write is to speak from the body, from desire and vulnerability and dream. So rather than this sort of rational voice that dominated much of Western thought, écriture féminine sought to express very differently. And I think The Third Body is a great representation of écriture féminine. The book is not a conventional narrative, it's more like a prose meditation in long form. The text moves between voices, so sometimes mother and child, sometimes lover and beloved, sometimes the living and the dead, and it's always impossible to tell who's speaking because the I and you keep dissolving into each other. I know I said earlier that her writing feels like liquid. I think maybe a more accurate way to describe it is that she writes in spirals or in waves, and I think her sentences move in the way that the sea does, in that her sentences are carried by rhythm, by emotion, by image, as opposed to plot. I feel like she resists being domesticated by plot and instead writes like the sea moves. I think that the best way to sort of describe her writing is to maybe read a little bit. And because ultimately, I think the book is about transformation. So it's about child and mother. It's about the lover who becomes the beloved. It's about the writer who becomes the one who is written about. So, for example, my mother has an important name. The name is Eve. My mother is still living. She is primordial. She is unforgettable. She is, at times, my daughter. So she slips on my clothes that are a little too long and too tight for her. She has this smile. I used to beg her to get up and turn on the light for me. It's a deeply spiritual book in the same way that, like, Rilke is spiritual. in the sense that it's this constant luminous search for something. The next book I have is The Children of the Dead by Elfriede Jelinek. By Elfriede Jelinek. I can never quite get this name right. But Children of the Dead is also a book that plays with language and, like the Book of Monelle, is haunted. So Jelinek was born in 1946 in Austria. She became best known for her book The Piano Teacher, which was also made into a film starring Isabelle Huppert. And if you've seen that, it's such a brilliant and deeply disturbing book and film. But I don't hear as many people talking about The Children of the Dead, and in my opinion, it is an absolute masterpiece. It's an ambitious and very difficult book, but definitely well worth your time. She called this a ghost novel when she wrote it, I think in 1995. And she's not little known. She is a Nobel laureate. She won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2004. And so she is not lesser known, but I think this book is. So this book, The Children of the Dead, is an epic set in the Austrian Alps, and it begins with a car crash, and from that moment the dead begin to rise. They climb out of rivers, out of the soil, out of memory itself. And there's no linear plot like a few of these books. I may have a preference. But instead we move through three main figures, Edgar, Gudrun, and Corinne, all of whom are dead, and they're trying to relive fragments of their lives. And around them there are thousands of other voices, ghosts of the Holocaust victims, tourists, animals, myth, advertising, bits of scripture. And so the novel becomes this grotesque resurrection of everything that Austria buried after World War II. It's complicity, it's violence, the refusal to remember, which is something that Jelinek really focuses and hones in on in this novel. Her style is very wild. She doesn't use paragraphs in a conventional way. Her sentences sort of tumble, or her sentences mutate, if that's the right way to say it, and they overflow with puns and wordplay and double meaning. It's like the language itself is decomposing. She once said that she wants to write from the inside the ruins of language until it starts revealing what it's hiding. So I think understanding that before going into this book will help it make a lot more sense as you're reading through it. There are moments where this book is very overwhelming, and then there are moments of just airy beauty. It's just, I love this book. And the trouble with talking about these books is sometimes I feel like I can't do them justice. But ultimately, I think the book is about memory. It's about what happens when a nation refuses that memory. And I think that she transforms Austria's tourist landscapes, like the ski resorts and the mountain lodges and the picture perfect villages, into graveyards. It's got a lot of dark humor running through it as well. It's kind of a bit absurd and quite relentless in the way that it reads. But I think that it's absolutely beautiful. And in the same way that Marcel Scwob resurrects Monelle, or Louise, in his book, in the same way I also think this book is an act of resurrection, but of Austria's past as opposed to a particular individual. Give it a read. It's amazing. Next up is Akhenaten, Dweller in Truth by Naguib Mahfouz. Again, not an underread writer. He's also a Nobel Prize winner. But he has a huge list of books that he's written. And I feel like Akhenaten, Dweller in Truth is one that I don't hear talked about a lot. hear about the Cairo trilogy, obviously. That is his masterpiece. Of what I've read of him, and I've read over 10 novels, I think 12 of his novels, but my favorite is the Cairo trilogy. I mean, it's a masterpiece. But Akhenaten, Dweller in Truth is also brilliant, much shorter, much more accessible than the Cairo trilogy. And I think if you haven't read Mahfouz before, you can definitely start here. We're also moving away, well, kind of. The last 4 books are quite heady and may not appeal to everyone because they can be sometimes difficult to follow. I mean, that's my favorite thing. I love when language does something a little crazy. Mahfouz writes in a much more clear, easy to follow style. His books are considered historical fiction. They're also quite philosophical. And I think where Scwob and Bachmann and Cixous write through fragmentation, Mahfouz does write with a lot of clarity. Naguib Mahfouz was an Egyptian novelist and the first Arab writer to win the Nobel Prize, and he spent his life chronicling the spirit of Cairo, its political instabilities, its mysticism, its people in all of their richness and diversity. And the book does stand at his classic crossroad of history and philosophy. The novel tells the story of Akhenaten, who's a heretic pharaoh of ancient Egypt who abolished Egypt's many gods in favor of one god, Aten, who's the sun king or the sun god. And he preached love and truth and light, but he also brought chaos to his kingdom. So, was he a prophet or was he a madman? Mahfouz doesn't answer that question directly. Instead, he tells the story through a young man, Merimut, who sets out to learn who Akhenaten really was. So he travels across Egypt. He interviews people who knew the pharaoh, so their priests, soldiers, enemies, and his wife, Nefertiti. And each tells a different story. So each claims to speak the truth, but the more Merimut listens, the more the truth begins to dissolve. The novel unfolds through a series of testimonies. They're kind of these little lyrical monologues that contradict one another. So it's like a mosaic, and no single testimony gives you the full picture, but instead they reveal something larger and far more mysterious. Mahfouz's prose is very spare. Every single line feels very deliberate, and each witness in the book reflects a different facet of Akhenaten's truth. And I think this is one of the most beautiful books because of what it leaves unsaid. Every time someone speaks about Akhenaten, they reveal as much about themselves as they do reveal about him. They reveal their fears, they reveal their longing for clarity, they reveal their pride. So by the end, the truth itself seems like a bit of a mirage, something that's just beyond reach, something that's always moving. And I think Mahfouz is he's an absolute master. He's one of those writers where I read and I think, how does someone write like this? Especially in the Cairo trilogy, but in this book as well. I think if you like Herman Broch or even Albert Camus, you'll get along really well with Mahfouz. Next up is Women Running in the Mountains by Yūko Tsushima, one of the great literary giants from Japan, whose father was also a literary giant, Osamu Dazai. Osamu Dazai took his own life, and much of Yūko Tsushima's writing deals with the absence of fathers and husbands and the systems that fail women in Japan. She wrote from the 1970s through to the 90s, but Tsushima's writing was completely centered on women's inner lives, their solitude, and a very slow and quiet resistance to systems in Japan. So, Women Running in the Mountains is about a young woman, Takiko, who gives birth to a child outside of marriage. And normally you'd think, well, I thought a novel starting there, it's kind of be this tragic story, right? About how this woman was rejected from a traditional Japanese society because of this happening. But instead, we don't really get that, which I love, is that we get this quiet struggle, perseverance for Takiko to claim her own life. Um, and what I love about Tsushima and a lot of Japanese writers that I find is that she doesn't tell the story in a big dramatic or confrontational way. She tells the story in a very slow um, way, and a way that sort of focuses on the everyday rhythms of life. So she's working in a nursery, she's walking through the city, she's finding joy in her son's laughter, she's finding peace in nature. And that's something I really appreciate about this book, is that it deals with this big struggle in this small and mundane ways that our protagonist is sort of having this resistance and carving out a life for herself. The language is very simple, it's very clear and spacious. It's I've always like felt like this book feels like walking. Like it's got a very steady rhythm and a very steady pace. Her style reminds me a lot of like Annie Ernaux or Natalia Ginsburg, in the way that they too focus on the mundane in order to communicate a form of resistance to the systems that they find themselves living in. And at the heart of the book, it is about freedom, but not in the kind of, big dramatic Mel Gibson yelling in Braveheart kind of way. Not in this heroic sense, but in the most intimate senses. And it's also about motherhood. Um, it's not idealized. You see the physical and exhausting act of raising a child alone. And also, it focuses on solitude, which is not the same as loneliness, and how joy can coexist with difficulty. That doing this alone, raising this child, being in solitude is difficult, but there is still joy to be found in the everyday amidst this. And I think what makes the book so beautiful is Tsushima's restraint. I feel like she's a writer that's not trying to impress. Sometimes I can read a book and I can almost feel the writer saying, "Look how good I am." And I think what's so cool is that she's not trying to impress. She isn't trying to dazzle. She is just writing the truth of being alive. And the character Takiko's beauty is the beauty of her endurance, of a woman moving through the world with just this quiet, unstoppable grace. It's like the heart of Tsushima's work as a whole. It's a woman moving beyond the reach of everyone else's expectations and into her own life. And I loved that. I absolutely loved it. It's turning the mundane into the sacred, like Clarice Lispector does, like Virginia Woolf does. It's within that same tradition. It's amazing. The next book is The Rock of Tanios by Amin Maalouf, uh, where Tsushima writes about the intimate and the interior. Amin Maalouf writes more about the collective, the way that memory and history shape our world. And he is one of my all-time favorite writers. I've read 4 of his books. I need to read more. Amin Maalouf was born in Beirut in 1949. He was a Lebanese French writer whose work, similar to Naguib Mahfouz, works with history and myth and philosophy. And his novels all often explore being caught between cultures, being caught between belonging and exile, and between faith and doubt. But this book in particular is the story of a modern day narrator who grows up hearing rumors about Tanios, who's a boy born under mysterious circumstances in a Lebanese mountain village during Ottoman times. And he's said to be the son of the village headman, but there's always a shadow over his parentage. It's a rumor that he might instead be the child of a local sheikh. And then when political rivalries and foreign intrigues enter the mountains, Tanios finds himself caught. And one day, after a fateful act, he climbs to the rock that bears his name and he disappears. And the novel becomes an inquiry into how legends are born and what happens when a man becomes his own myth. The book also really focuses on how history pulls at ordinary lives. And, through Tanios, Amin Maalouf captures the weight of the Middle East's long entanglement with empire and faith. But ultimately, I think the book is really about memory and how people turn into symbols and how those symbols shape us in return. And I think what I love about Mahfouz's writing is the way in which his writing feels ancient and modern at the same time. It's completely unique. He moves effortlessly between personal and historical. Like in one sentence, he might be describing the texture of a village meal, and then the next, he's reflecting on the fall of empire. Um, Very, very unique writing that I haven't really seen before. And my last point is that there's a quiet sorrow that runs through the book that really stayed with me and resonated with me. It's this sense that understanding always arrives too late. That was a big feeling that stayed with me. I think if you love Orhan Pamuk or Isabel Allende, he's quite reminiscent of them in the sense that they're also storytellers that blend mythic and historical elements into their books. And Amin Maalouf certainly does that. I've found this one unforgettable. I was debating between The Rock of Tanios or Samarkand, but I ultimately went with this one. Oh, this next one is so hard to talk about because I love it so much and I don't know how to articulate myself clearly when it comes to Anaïs Nin. I have here Cities of the Interior, which is 5 continuous novels: Ladders to Fire, Children of the Albatross, The Far-Chambered Heart, A Spy in the House of Love, and Seduction of the Minotaur, but they're all meant to be one book. We're going inward again. We're going inward again, like Bachmann, like Cixous, that's my jam, okay? It's writing the interior. And Anaïs Nin's work is a labyrinth of the self. And I think few writers capture the interior life with such precision. No one, to me, does it like Anaïs Nin. I first was exposed to her journals, which I plan to make a whole video completely dedicated to Anaïs Nin's diaries. But I wouldn't even know where to start. It's too difficult. And Cities of the Interior is like an architectural work of the inner world. It's a 5-volume cycle of novels that map the landscape of emotion and memory and desire. So Anaïs Nin was born in Paris in 1903, and she spent her life between Europe and the Americas, and between languages and between lovers and between identities. And she is often remembered for her diaries and for her connection with Henry Miller, but her real legacy should be Cities of the Interior, and I will fight for it. Nin was a part of the modernist movement, but she was never fully a part of it. I think her contemporaries focused a lot more on the external world, but she did turn inward, and she was writing the psyche as landscape. The self here is unfolding like a cities of the interior. And together, these 5 books trace the emotional and spiritual life of several women who are really the facet of one consciousness. And just like earlier, there's no traditional plot, and instead, the books move through dream, love, art, exile, jealousy, And ultimately, I think at the heart of Nin's work, it's about self creation. You see that in her diaries, you see it here in her fiction. It's self creation. And I think the book is so beautiful because it speaks from the deepest interior. And her prose is so ecstatic, it's fierce, but also tender. You can feel the influences of like D.H. Lawrence and her, but no, not really. No, I'm going to take that back. Her voice is unmistakably her own. It's confessional, it is the sound of consciousness. And I think reading this book feels like walking through a cathedral built out of feeling. It's nothing, I mean, it's not something you can read once. I feel like it's something that you live with. And I've been returning to Cities of the Interior every chance I get because of the way that it has changed me and shifted my perception ever so slightly, which is such a powerful thing for any piece of art, books, film, music. I mean, when something does that, that is the pinnacle of what art can do. It's a map to the soul. I feel like I've just rambled. I do want to do an entire video dedicated to Anaïs because I feel like I can't distill her into a short fragment. She needs more time. TBC. Okay, we are down to the last two books. I had to include some Australians on this list. If you can't tell from my accent, I am Australian. And we have quite a number of incredible writers. So I've picked two. And then we're going to be ending because I feel like this video is quite long. The book that one of the first of the two books that I want to highlight is Praiseworthy by Alexis Wright. Wow. This book is about survival and endurance. It's about colonization. It's about the climate crisis. Alexis Wright is an Aboriginal Australian woman, and she, I think, is our best writer. One of our best. Her and who's coming next are contenders for our greatest Australian writers. Her writing combines oral storytelling. I've been talking for too long. Oral storytelling traditions and Indigenous cosmology, which makes it so fascinating to read. And there's also a lot of political resistance in Alexis Wright's works in general. She writes as country, if that makes sense. Her writing is alive, it's ancestral, it's so vivid, it's defiant, and her writing bends time and it bends syntax and it bends what a novel can be. So, Praiseworthy begins in a small town in the Australian desert, and our central figure, Causman Street, dreams of starting a donkey transport business. It's a vision of his that's part genius, part madness, uh, born from desperation, really, and hope. And around him spin his family, his community, the ancestral spirits, and the encroaching catastrophe of climate change or climate collapse. Um, the book is really vast, it's unpredictable, it jumps from character to character, so there's no single POV, it's more of like a choir of voices, and there's elements of magical realism and satire and myth, and the writing is so fiercely intelligent. She draws from, you know, cadences of oral storytelling where stories are performed. So it can be a bit of a challenge to read. Like, it did take me probably like 50 to 100 pages to become in awe of it because I was sort of adjusting to this new style. But once I got it, it sort of reawakened how I read. It was just amazing. At its heart, I think the book is about survival of people, of culture, of the planet itself. It asks, what happens when a world built on extraction and greed begins to collapse, and what other kinds of knowledge might save us. And it's also about the aftermath of colonization and the way that it fractures community and the way that it fractures culture, um, and connection to country. But what I love also about Alexis Wright is her humor. There's levity here. There's lightness as well, and that's quite a difficult thing for a writer to do, to talk about issues of such gravity, but also incorporate elements of humor, satire, and lightness. Um, and what I love most is her characters refuse to vanish, which I think if anyone knows the history of Australia and our First Nations people, that is quite just a powerful element that runs through this entire novel. It's one of the most extraordinary novels of this century. I'll say it. The last book, oh my goodness, we're finally here. Border Districts by Gerald Murnane. Gerald Murnane is one of Australia's most singular writers. I haven't read an Australian that writes like him. He was born in 1939. He spent a lot of his life in rural Victoria. He rarely left the country. His novels are meditations on seeing and remembering and the kind of fragile architecture of thought. He is often called Australia's Proust, and there is a definite Proustian influence, particularly in his descriptions of the ability of light to evoke memories. So there's a section in here about his obsession, not just with colors, but also the memories that colors evoke. And there's a bit where he purchases, as an adult, a set of colored pencils, and that part was so Proustian. Because I had heard he was called the Australian Proust, and I was like, oh yeah. But then I read that, and I was like, oh no, yeah, that is very Proustian. So the story is about a man who moves to a small town on the edge of the Australian plains near an unnamed border to live out his final years. And the book evokes the slow moving pace of country life, and it's less a story and more of a collection of feelings and sensations in which Murnane hurriedly um, organizes the thoughts he has on certain topics and objects, both from his past and those he stumbles upon in his new home. And within the stillness of country life, this entire world of vision and memory opens up. The unnamed narrator spends his time arranging coloured glass in his window and recalling images from childhood. And the narrator is haunted by images from a Catholic childhood, and so he's seeking the feeling of revelation. But beneath it all is the ache of solitude as he lives alone in the country. And the novel unfolds in these long paragraphs of perception about what the mind holds on to when the noise and chaos of life falls away and you live in quiet and stillness. And through these fragments, he tries to find what he calls the carpet of, no, the pattern in the carpet, and the invisible design that holds life together, which is what the pattern in the carpet is. Much like writers like Yūko Tsushima, his words are so carefully placed. His rhythm is very slow and contemplative, and I remember when I was reading it, I felt like my breathing changed. My breathing slowed down a little bit to sort of match the narrator's pace. I just loved it. This is the only Gerald Murnane that I've read. I own two more of his books, and I can't wait to get to them because Border Districts was just phenomenal. We're at the end. We did it. We've made it. If you're still watching, wow, thank you. This is the first video that I've ever made, and hopefully as time goes on, I will get used to speaking in front of a camera and not feeling too awkward. I hope that goes away in time, but please do let me know what you've thought of this video, of the books that I've mentioned. Since this is my first video, please also feel free to leave me tips for improvement. I'm still getting used to lighting and, you know, the tech, which is still so weird to me. And I feel like I've lost a lot of natural light. That's annoying. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye.